Good evening and welcome to the Southeast Vermont SISMA webinar. SISMA stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association. We are a partnership of invasive plant experts, public and private land managers, and engaged members of the public. We work to raise awareness of invasive species, leverage collective action and volunteer projects, and provide resources and assistance to the community. In this webinar, we will introduce our presenters, quickly review some important terminology, and cover a variety of topics regarding chemical treatments. There will be time for questions and answers at the conclusion of the presentation. Tonight's presenters are myself, Corey Ross, District Manager for the Windham Conservation District, Jack Minnick, Land Management Coordinator for Vermont Land Trust, Andrew Morrison, Consulting Forester and Vermont Licensed Pesticide Applicator, and Peter Van Loan, Lead Forester for the Vermont Land Trust. Jack?
Ready. Thanks, Corey. So some grounding terminology for this webinar. Invasive species are non-native species introduced into a new location by human activity, either on purpose or by accident, and they are capable of thriving at the expense of native species. And for chemical management options, when we use that phrase, we mean research-based techniques that complement non-herbicide treatments and/or are standalone techniques to manage invasive plants. And with that, I'll pass it off to, I believe, Peter.
No, it's actually me. So thank you so much to Jack and Corey for starting us off. I'm Andrew Morrison. I'm a consulting forester in Windham County. And I also have a long background in invasive plant management in a previous profession. So I want to say hello to everybody tonight. And also, it's kind of a shame that we can't be doing this in person because oftentimes at these events, one of the organizers brings along cookies. So I would have appreciated a cookie this evening, but we're going to have to do it virtually, and I think it'll be just fine. So I want to start out this evening talking about invasive plants, and as the title there says, why do we care? And I think that's really the foundation for this conversation, because later tonight we're going to talk about trade-offs and ethical decisions, and I think it's really important to be, thanks Sam, it's really important to be grounded in why invasive plants are an important topic to care about. So they have a real impact. And first I want to talk about, Jack touched upon the idea of loss of habitat or competition. So invasive plants are capable of creating monoculture situations that provide direct competition for native plants and also alter or degrade the habitat that's needed not just by other native plants, but by animal species, and they're capable of altering those ecosystems long term. And the U.S. Forest Service has estimated that 49% of our nation's imperiled species, so that's a combination of both endangered and threatened species, owe some portion of their decline to invasive plant species. And that's either because of competition or predation or the spread of diseases, but they're having a really big impact on our native ecosystems, both plants and animals. And the next topic here is about loss of resilience. And I don't probably need to tell most of the folks attending this evening that our forests are up against a lot of challenges. There's a lot of stressors, including novel diseases, insect pests, climate change, fragmentation and development of our forest ecosystems. And the healthier the ecosystems, the forested ecosystems are, the better chance they have of surviving these other impacts. And so invasive plant species are an additional stressor that is lowering the forest resilience to overcoming these other challenges that the forested ecosystems are facing. And lastly, and I don't think this is leastly, invasive plants have a real economic impact on our area. So, Vermont is a very rural economy. A lot of our economy is founded in our natural resources, including active forestry, active agriculture, and then the aesthetics that we get out of our forested and agriculture systems that bring a lot of tourism and a lot of tourism dollars. And, as a consulting foresters in the area are constantly having conversations about the impact that invasive plant species have on being able to harvest a forest and get native plants to grow back. And our landowners that we assist are either having to invest additional dollars into invasive plant control, or they're otherwise seeing, long-term losses. So invasive plants have a real impact. So moving on, I think we would be remiss this evening to talk about chemical management without talking about the larger context of management in general. And so I'm going to start out talking about integrated pest management, or IPM as its nickname. And IPM is a decision-making process that it's a science-based process. It uses monitoring and thresholds to determine how and when you might control a pest. And it's a multi-pronged approach. So this isn't just about chemical control. Integrated pest management uses biological control, physical control, which you could also call mechanical control if you wanted, chemical control, and cultural control. And utilizing all four prongs of this, we get a control methodology or a plan that will help us to manage the pest over time. And I know that's some jargon, so I'm going to give an example I think might be more realistic for the rest of you. So Corey, if we hop to the next slide here. So this is a personal story. This is about my mice, and they're not pets. But it's a story of integrated pest management that's pretty close to home. So if we click here, this is your average little white-footed mouse. And many of these small creatures were entering into our house each night. So if you click, we'd wake up in the morning and there'd be little mouse feces on the countertop. And if you click, we've got, they were nibbling on the foods that we were leaving on the countertop. They liked apples and bananas. They liked baking grease in the pan. And so it started becoming clear that we had quite a mouse problem. And so if I take an integrated pest management approach to this, I can use each of those prongs to think about how I attack this situation I did. So the first click here is a biological control. So this is our cat. Her name is Yams. She's actually a pretty good mouser. It doesn't look like it from this photo. She's having a nice nap, but I think Yams was keeping the mice from coming down off of the counter and getting everywhere else in our house, but they had found this clever way of coming up the back of our refrigerator and down onto the countertop, and Yams was not an effective biological control on top of the countertop. So I moved on to some mechanical control options. If we click here, I pulled the refrigerator out and stuffed steel wool into the obvious cracks where the mice were entering into the house. And then another click, and I implemented some simple mouse traps. And the most important thing that I think that we did is I'm going to skip over chemical control because I didn't use it in this instance, but I used cultural control. And cultural control in this example would be the process of taking the effort every evening to remove the food sources from the countertop, cleaning the countertops every evening, and making sure that it was, everything was spruced up. And so the end of this story is that in 2 nights, we caught 10 mice, and then that was it. We caught no mice for 5 nights after that. I finally sort of declared victory and took the traps down. And so if I had decided to ignore integrated pest management in this example, what if I decided to just set traps, put out lots of traps, and just kill all the mice that came along? I mean, you all know that winter is approaching here in Vermont and the house is warm. I'm leaving food all over the countertop. There's an easy way into the house from outside. I don't think the numbers would have stopped at 10, and I'm not sure how many mice would have found their way into our warm, cozy, food-filled house. So the pest battle would have seemed endless. And so I want to think about this now, ask you the question, how might you apply this sort of approach to an invasive plant situation? If your first reaction is, well, I'm just going to go grab some herbicide and spray, or I'm just going to grab some strong work gloves and I'm going to start pulling, then you might be entering into a losing battle. In other words, invasive plant battles are hard-won battles. And I'm going to use that hard-won battles phrase a number of times this evening because I think it's really true. And oftentimes in invasive plants, there's a lot of factors that are outside your control as a landowner. You might not have any control over what your neighbor is doing, or you may not have control over the entirety of a patch of invasives or something like that. So in these really difficult battles, it's important that you take a combination of approaches, that you have a mechanical approach, you have a chemical approach, and you take a cultural approach in order to achieve success. So I wish that getting rid of the invasives in my property was as easy as getting rid of the mice in my kitchen. Anyhow, we'll go to the next slide here, Corey. And integrated pest management is about using all four of these tools. And I'm going to talk this evening about this being a toolbox, using all four of these tools in the toolbox in order to have success. And so, in invasive plant control, biological control is often something that's happening at maybe the statewide level. It's a regional response. We have state agencies and universities that are working to assist us with biological controls. Physical controls are mechanical treatments. Chemical controls are the chemical herbicides that we're going to touch on tonight. And cultural controls, which I think should never be forgotten, and they're very important. These are things like our ornamental planting process and, when and where and how much are we investing in control as landowners and as a community and as a state or a region. So all of these are going to be important to achieving success. So if we here, hopefully some of you had the opportunity to check into the Southeastern Vermont SISMA webinar on mechanical options. And if you haven't, it's been archived and you can reference back to that because, that mechanical option is part of this toolbox. And if you're watching tonight's webinar, then that webinar will help you sort of round out your understanding of the tools available. But I'm going to do just a very brief review here. And I'm going to start out just talking about the fact that mechanical options provide a spectrum of control. So on the first click, we see that, hand pulling is a mechanical option that is sort of at the low end of impact, the high end of labor involved. That's myself in the yellow, helping a group of volunteers pull glossy buckthorn on land owned by the Putney Mountain Association. And so on the next click, they talked about grazing during that webinar. So if you're interested in grazing, this is a sheep that's been actively grazing buckthorn, also for the Putney Mountain Association. But I know people are interested in goats as grazers and some other grazing animals. That's a topic covered in that presentation. And on the next click, there are some really amazing mechanical options. And so this is a Brontosaurus mower. It's actually not a Brontosaurus brand mower. It turns out that a Brontosaurus is similar to Kleenex or Band-Aids. It's a brand name. But these mowers got their name for looking like giant dinosaurs as they gobble up trees from the top down. And so a Brontosaurus mower is one potential mechanical option that's working on a really large scale. And so today's presentation is going to focus mainly on chemicals as a tool, but I want to review these mechanical options because, number one, I want to cover a topic we're going to come back to, which is that the intensity of your response to invasives should be matched well to the intensity of the invasives you have. If you have a couple of glossy buckthorn plants on your property, hiring a Brontosaurus mower might be considered overkill. And vice versa, if you have tens, 20, 30 acres of invasive plants, and you're not in, you have a full-time job, and hand pulling all of that might not be the best solution either. So the intensity of the two should match up with each other. So I also want to review mechanical options because they pair very well as part of IPM with chemical control options. And so, Corey, if you click, we've got another personal story here. And I spent 5 years professionally controlling invasive plants. And so you may have the misimpression that there are no invasive plants on my personal property, right? I'm some sort of invasive plant angel. But that's not the case. We all have our challenges, and invasive plants impact everybody. So this is a story about my buckthorn. And it's a story about mixing options close to home. So pairing mechanical control options and chemical control options, and just showing how that process could work in a situation that achieves the best result through IPM. So on the first click, this is a field edge on my property, and this time of year, glossy buckthorn hasn't really lost its leaves. They're still green. And Corey, if you hover in that bottom right-hand corner, the green foliage there is glossy buckthorn. And then we've got a large maple tree back there, and there's some green foliage higher up, just in front of that maple tree right there. Nicely pointed, Corey. And that's glossy buckthorn growing along this field edge I've got. And so last year I came through and I pulled most, but obviously not all, of the small glossy buckthorn plants. And it took me about a day of hand pulling. I waited till the springtime when the soils were nice and moist and plants came up very easily. And the next click shows you the nice big pile of glossy buckthorn that I accumulated using a mechanical option, hand pulling. But there were some plants, like the one in front of that maple, that were still there. They were just really large that I couldn't handle. So this mechanical option might be to use my tractor to pull those plants out. And if you watch that webinar, you'll hear that mechanical pulling can actually do a lot of soil disturbance and cause a lot of damage on plants of that size. And so rather than continue with a mechanical approach on those larger plants, I chose to use a chemical approach. And so on the next click, these are the stumps that are left over 1 year later of glossy buckthorn that I cut down and applied a concentrated herbicide to the cut surface of the stem. That's a method called this cut stem treatment method. And I got fantastic results. I've never had difficulty with getting fantastic results with the cut stem treatment method. And that chemical method controlled those larger plants. And you can see, because the stump is still there, you don't cause any soil disturbance. You're not having to wrench those plants out. So, but on the last click here, we have to recognize that these battles aren't entirely over. And so this very artistic photo is of the glossy buckthorn seedlings that are still coming into my property, because I still have glossy buckthorn elsewhere, and the birds consume the berries and they deposit the seeds throughout the area. And for these small seedlings, I will go back to a mechanical control approach because they're very easy to pull. And, I'm often asked, like, well, do I have to get every seedling every year because that's a lot of effort? And the answer is not necessarily. The last time I did a literature review, glossy buckthorn in full sunlight can take about 3 years to make it to the the level, the height, and health where it's starting to produce berries and spread on its own. And in a forested setting, that number could be closer to 5 years. So if you're out there each year looking for your glossy buckthorn and you miss some of them, then it's not as large of an issue as you might think. You would just hopefully then catch them the next year or the year after that. And you've got a number of years to catch them before they're really becoming a problem. So, and I just, this is one example of how you could pair mechanical and chemical options, but another example might be that you've got a much more severe infestation of invasive plants. And so you've contracted with somebody who comes in with a mower, like a Brontosaurus mower, and they grind all that material up for you. And that's going to do several things. Number one, it's going to increase access. Number two, it will actually kill some of those plants. Depending on how the contractor uses the equipment, they may destroy enough of some of those plants to cause them to die. And then the plants that haven't died are going to resprout. They are going to respond, and a chemical treatment can follow up on that resprouting. But the volume and the intensity of chemical needed and the ability to have, a site of the area know where to apply those herbicides is going to be greatly improved. And so by pairing those two approaches, you've reduced the amount of herbicide you've needed to use, and you've just sort of enhanced your ability to get successful treatment. So the two techniques pair nicely. And we shouldn't forget that cultural control and biological control are part of the puzzle too. But all right, so on to the next slide, and we're going to start talking now about herbicides. And so a big part of the topic tonight is going to be around this idea of why herbicides. I know that the phrase herbicide is not well loved, and so I'm here tonight as to reluctantly stand in defense of herbicides as part of this toolbox of control methods. And so I want to broadly talk about how might you evaluate any option for invasive plant control. And these are the criteria that I came up with. Maybe you would have some others, but is it effective, right? That seems like a very reasonable criteria for choosing an option for invasive plant control. Is it safe, both for you as the individual and for the environment that is being treated? And is it efficient? And so I want to look at how herbicides sort of rank out in this. So Corey, if you click, herbicides for invasive plant control. And it has been shown time and time again that herbicides are able to get us predictable, consistent results for invasive plant control. And this is true so much to the case that the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which will provide cost funding or cost assistance to private landowners and nonprofits that are trying to control invasive plants, they have scaled back majorly their funding of mechanical options because mechanical options alone were shown time and time again not to provide consistent results. And they primarily only fund chemical treatment options because these are taxpayer funds that are being provided for invasive plant control, and they had a threshold that needed to be met in order to consider a practice to be successful. And chemical treatment methods were able time and again to hit that threshold. Herbicides also allow us to get targeted control. In the mechanical option review, I mentioned grazers and I mentioned mowing solutions, and a brush mower and a goat are not targeted methods. You can put them into an area, but they will consume whatever it is their preference is in that area. A brush mower is going to consume everything in front of the tractor, and a goat is going to consume everything that they find palatable. So with an herbicide, you have a human individual who's trained, who's deciding which plants are to be targeted. And it also provides lasting control. The herbicides that I would recommend for invasive plant control are systemic herbicides, and that chemical is being transported from wherever you apply it down into the root system of the plant, and it's killing the root system of the plant. So you're getting lasting control on those plants. So that's the effective portion of this. I'm actually gonna say just right now for safe that the answer is generally yes, but that's a big conversation and we're gonna talk about it more later on in the webinar. And then are they efficient? And I think that efficient is another one of these phrases that maybe we have some prejudices against because it sounds like something that's very capitalist, right? Like we're all supposed to be very efficient. And I want to dispel that because a lot of times the clients I've worked with in the past have been conservation organizations or landowners, and invasive plant control doesn't exist in a void. And a conservation organization, they have lots of goals that require both time and money. And if they can be efficient with both their time and money when they're doing invasive plant control, then maybe they could put those resources towards some of their other goals, like conserving additional land or rehabilitating habitats or monitoring for threatened species or outreach to their citizen base, whatever it might be. If you're efficient at one task, you have resources available to complete some other tasks that might achieve your goals. And if anybody out there this evening is listening to this and they don't have scarce financial or time resources, please email me, text me, call my phone number, whatever it takes, knock on my door, because I surely have scarce financial and time resources. And I think most everybody does. So herbicides are unarguably efficient. They are multiplying person hours when we're utilizing them. And we do all have scarce financial and time resources. And so it is helpful that herbicides are efficient. I wouldn't be scared away by that phrase. So if we go to the next slide there, sorry, Corey, there is a quick, but don't forget that they are also part of a toolbox, right? That they're not being used just by themselves. They're being used as part of this system. So, all right, on to the next one. So I wanted to provide sort of the spectrum of herbicide options that are out there. Similarly, just sort of a broad review. So on the first click, some of the most targeted available are things like the cut stem treatment method, where you're cutting individual stems and you're applying herbicide directly to that cut surface. So it's a very targeted method. The next click, spot spraying. This is myself out in a field. I don't exactly remember, but I imagine that this was some follow-up work on purple loosestrife. So spot spraying is, you're using maybe a backpack style sprayer to spray just the plants you're interested in controlling with an herbicide solution. The applicator has a lot of control in that situation. On the next click, this is a motorized mist blower. And so a motorized mist blower is allowing you to broadcast herbicide into a much larger area. And it's a tool that could be used for a much larger infestation of invasive plants. And the last click, this is maybe the biggest tool in the toolbox. That is a hydro sprayer. So there's a tank of herbicide. There's a pump that's pumping herbicide through that hose apparatus. And this is like a super soaker for herbicide that's being utilized on a really tall and consistent infestation of invasive plants. So this is similar to mechanical options. The type of approach you're using should be paired well to the infestation that you're up against. And so on the final click here, Corey, this is a reminder, that's me standing in front of some knotweed, and it's a reminder not to bring a knife to a gunfight. I'm standing here with the wrong tool in terms of the herbicide, the available herbicide options. I'm standing there with the wrong tool for the situation in front of me. I've clearly showed up to a gunfight holding a knife. And so you make sure that you're pairing your options well, because that's going to help you achieve success. And over time, it actually may decrease the amount of harm you're doing, because the first punch with herbicides is really the one that counts. That's got to really, that's when the plants are healthy, they have the greatest leaf surface area, which has the greatest potential to get those herbicides down to the root and get lasting control. So you've really got to do it right the first time around. And going in too soft can have bad consequences long-term in terms of success. So the next topic, so one of the herbicide options that often comes up is these questions about natural herbicides. And natural herbicides have really gained a lot of interest over the, sorry about that. They've really gained a lot of interest over the last couple of years, and I get asked a lot of questions. So I want to start out by addressing this top issue first. Just because something occurs naturally doesn't make it safe. And just because something is synthetic doesn't inherently make it dangerous. And, for very simple example, arsenic and both the botulism toxic are both naturally occurring substances. One of them can be found in our soils, and one of them is produced by a living organism on this planet that, isn't any thing that we imagined. And botulism toxin is one of the most toxic substances known to humans, but it's totally naturally occurring. And I wouldn't want to tangle with either of those things. But in contrast to that, polar fleece is entirely synthetic. I wear a fleece jacket into the woods when I do much of my work, and maybe some of you this evening are snuggled up with a fleece blanket, although it's not really that cold of a night. So a bizarre climate, as somebody commented right at the beginning of the webinar. But just because fleece is synthetic doesn't make it inherently dangerous. And I could wear that fleece jacket every day for the rest of my life, and I don't think it would cause me any personal harm. So rather than judge something on whether or not it's natural or synthetic, I think it's much more fair, that's not really correct grammar, but to ask the same set of questions. Is it effective?
Yeah, totally. I totally get it. I do. Totally understand.
We've got somebody who's
okay. So when is her birthday? When's he going?
And any luck there, Corey? Great. And is it efficient? Because that seems like those are the fair questions to ask. And so I've pulled out an example here, and I pulled out this example. If you click next, Corey, I pulled out this example because I get asked about it often and I see it often. So this is concentrated vinegar. It's available for sale in my local hardware store right alongside the synthetic herbicides that are available there. And this is pretty common. Concentrated vinegars are typically sold as a 20% or 30% vinegar solution. And they're being labeled for plant control. So that's, this is 30% vinegar home and garden. And they're intending you to use this for plant control. So the first question is, are these products effective? And I want to talk about how they work, right? Vinegar is a strong acid. That's the action it's using to impact the plant. So the strong acid is killing the leaves of that plant and causing those leaves to fall off. So that is an effective way of killing an annual plant. If you've got something that you know, it's only alive for 1 year. If you make all of its leaves go away, it's likely going to die back. But it's not an effective way of controlling something that's perennial, something that's using its root system to grow year after year, which is a true perennial. You know, I would say probably close to 90% of our invasive plants are perennials. So in terms of, is this effective at controlling a perennial plant? I think the answer is no. This, not at least with one application. It would require repeated applications year after year. So I think that it gets a dubious rating on the effectiveness scale. So the second question, is it safe? And, you know, if you click on there, Corey, you will see that this is a product which the manufacturer has labeled as natural safe. That's not actually, that's not a correct grammar as far as I know, but natural safe is how they've chosen to label this. And I would start with, is it safe for you as the applicator? And so we're dealing with a strong acid solution here. And if you click again, Corey, I took a photo of the first aid label on this. And it's nothing that scary, but you know, if you swallow, call poison control, do not induce vomiting. This is a strong acid. It will have caused a chemical burn as it went down. And if you vomit, it'll cause a chemical burn as it comes back up. So that, you know, call poison control. This is a strong acid. If you get it in your eyes, you should flush for 15 minutes and then call your doctor immediately. Same thing if you're getting it on your skin. So, you know, this is, if you're using it as a spray solution and it's aerosolizing and you inhale it, you know, they're saying you should move that person to fresh air. These aren't that scary of a first aid, but they're not that different from the first aid labeling on a lot of synthetic chemicals. But because synthetic chemicals are labeled under agreements with the Environmental Protection Agency, a chemical that had a first aid label like this would have a danger warning on it, because that's what the law says. But because this isn't a registered pesticide, the manufacturer gets to write the phrase natural safe on the front and then have a litany of first aid recommendations on the side label, because you know, we're not comparing apples and oranges here. So as an applicator, I would say that, no, this is not an inherently safe substance. You should be wearing eye protection and gloves and long shirt and long pants, right? That you should be using protective equipment because it's a dangerous acid. And so then that brings up the question of, well, okay, so safe for the applicator, is it safe for the environment? And that you know, is it environmentally friendly? And if we're using this, we're going to apply it year after year after year, possibly across large areas of land. And so that use is going to acidify soils. And everybody should remember that acid rain was, you know, a hot button environmental topic not that long ago. Acidifying soils has huge impacts for living creatures, both plants and other organisms in the soil. And not just the acidification of the soil, but contact is an issue as well with something like concentrated vinegar, right? This is a 30% vinegar solution that will burn you if you get it on your skin. The same is true for caterpillars or insects or amphibians or any other organisms living on the plants, in that habitat, or inside the soil in which you're applying this product. So my feeling on this product is it's dangerous to the people applying it. It could be dangerous to our soils. It's dangerous to the plants. And it doesn't provide us with effective long-term control. It seems like it's a lose-lose-lose situation to me. And, you know, that's true for a number of these solutions that have been described to me, including salt solution is one of them. I know very personally through research the impacts that road salt has on the buffering vegetation next to our roads and any wetland areas or riparian areas that are near our roadways, right? Road salting is nobody's friend, and why we should bring that practice into the forest to try to control invasive plants doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. If you're applying enough salt to the soil that plants aren't growing there anymore, then you've got a really big issue. Then, another one is boiling water, and boiling water is not going to get you prolonged control on a perennial plant, but you have scalded any soil organisms that are living in the area, and you've scalded any creatures that were living in that habitat as well. So, all of these solutions, although they are natural, in the instances that I've researched, they don't appear to be effective, and they don't appear to be environmentally safe, and sometimes they're not even safe for the applicators. So I would just really caution you around choosing a natural control option just because it's labeled as such. So Corey, if we move on from concentrated vinegar. Before we get here, I want to sort of indicate that I am not alone in my sense of why herbicides are something that should be part of invasive plant control. And I didn't get to that place easily or naturally. I came to a place of understanding the role that herbicides play in invasive plant control through years of professional experience trying to control invasive plants and understanding how effective some options were over others, and what were the results and what kind of response did I see the habitat having after that control. And I'm not alone in that assessment. And in the 5 years that I worked on invasive plant control professionally, I had clients that included the Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon, Vermont Land Trust, and several other conservation agencies throughout New England that have decided that herbicides should be part of the toolkit for helping to control invasive plants. So if at this point I've kept you long enough that you're thinking, okay, I'd like to learn more about how do I use herbicides as part of an invasive plant solution for my property, you might want to integrate chemicals into your control plans, but it's complicated. We've talked already about phrases like systemic or mode of action. And, there's a lot of options, and there are a lot of chemicals out there, and they are not all created equal. So here are some resources to get you started. The first one is the VT Invasives website. And if you've watched if you've watched the mechanical control webinar, you might have heard of the VT Invasives website from there. This is an amazing resource that has been put together, not just for Vermonters, but it applies to most all of New England. And I've worked in Massachusetts, I worked in Connecticut and Rhode Island for a while. And I would send everybody who had questions back to the Vermont website, because no offense anybody else, this website has done it better than many of the others out there. It's very user-friendly, and it is just packed with information. And the sort of information you're likely to get there is information on identifying invasive plants, information about the life cycle of the invasive plant you identified, or what are the range of treatment options. And it's going to talk to you about what are mechanical options that are available, what are chemical options that are available, what time of year are they appropriate to be used. And it's really important that you come into this informed, because I've said it once, and now I get to say it again, invasive plant battles are hard won. So you need to be an informed opponent or an informed adversary, because the invasive plants are a really difficult opponent. And so if you are not correctly identifying invasive plants, or you don't understand their life cycle and you're trying to control them with the wrong method at the wrong time, then you're not going to get success, but you also actually may do more harm to the natural environment than you would have otherwise. So it's really important that you get yourself that information, and the VT Invasives website is a good place for that. So then the next one I want to talk about is this core certification training manual for pesticide applicators. This resource is as boring as its title sounds. If my presentation isn't putting you to sleep, then buy the core manual because it will help you fall asleep each evening. But I don't want to hate on it too much because it is an incredible resource. It is jam-packed. What makes it so boring is that it is jam-packed with absolutely everything you might need to know. And anybody who has sought a commercial applicator's license needs to take a test that is based on this core certification manual. And it covers integrated pest management. It covers safety around herbicides, storage, mixing, environmental considerations, anything you could imagine. And it's all covered top to bottom in the core manual. And it's really, if you are considering, utilizing herbicides or pesticides yourself on your property, and this is going to be a major part of your strategy, the core manual is worth investing in, both in time and money. And the link there is to the Vermont Division of Pesticides that'll have more information about this, but the manual is available for purchase through the Cornell Extension Service. And last I looked, it was $41, which is a really weird dollar figure. I don't know why it's not $40, but it's $41, and it's really, this is an important piece of equipment. Just like if you bought a chainsaw, you would invest in a pair of safety chaps and a helmet. If you're going to invest in using chemical herbicides as part of an invasive plant control, this is an important tool to invest in. It's worth putting your time into understanding the elements of the core manual, or at least skimming through it so you know how to reference it later. And the core manual is going to teach you a lot about the last item on this list, which is the pesticide label.
Hey, Andrew.
Yes.
Thanks for mentioning that, because one of our participants had asked a question about that. And I just wanted to let you know that we got about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I'll scoot along, and some of the safety stuff will. So the pesticide label, I mentioned earlier that the Environmental Protection Agency has its hands in labeling all chemical herbicides, and that label is consistent across all herbicides, and it has a ton of really important information on it. The very first thing you're going to find is the active ingredient and the percentage of that active ingredient. The label is also going to tell you more information about that product. Like, it will tell you, what plant species am I allowed to use this on? What plant species does this chemical control? It'll tell you what environments it can be used in. Can it be used near water? Can it be used in an agricultural setting? Can it be used in your forest? It's going to have information on how you mix that product. What concentration do you use it at? It will tell you what different ways of applying that product are legally allowed. So the pesticide label is going to answer so many questions you may have about a particular chemical product. And I'm guilty, as everybody else is, of buying things and never touching the instruction manual. But the pesticide label is an instruction manual you should read. These pesticides are dangerous products to you and the environment, and you should read the instruction manual. All the information is there. It's an incredible resource, and you shouldn't ignore it. So we can move on from the pesticide label. I think I've probably berated that enough. So at this point, you may be thinking to yourself, well, I was thinking I would do this myself, but maybe I'd prefer getting a professional to help me. So there are contractors in our area that do invasive plant control. That is their sole focus, and they do a good job at it. And so, all contractors, I don't care if you're getting your kitchen tiled or you're getting a birthday cake for your child's upcoming birthday, a contractor should be easy to communicate with. They should be honest with you, and they should be fair, right? Those should be givens. But there are important considerations that are specific to invasive plant control. And one of them is, I have yet to meet a contractor that can't give you an upfront cost estimate. This shouldn't be something you're flying into blind. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh, maybe I would like to have a contractor look at this, give a contractor a call. Many of them will come out and provide you with an estimate on what they think your project may cost. And that could help as a good starting point in your decision-making process. A contractor should be properly licensed. You are inviting them to your property to use an herbicide, right? They should have the legal paperwork to indicate that they've taken the training and they know how to use that product, et cetera. And along those lines, your contractor should be communicating with you about what technique they're using and what chemicals they will be applying. You should be informed about that, and they should be able to answer questions that you have about, what is the herbicide they have selected? Why did they select it? What are the dangers to you or your property, et cetera? And they are required by law after the treatment to provide you with information about what was applied and how much of it was applied. You should be getting that from your contractor. And lastly, a contractor should be guaranteeing their work. The NRCS is sort of, I mentioned them earlier, they have made this a part of this industry. The NRCS tells contractors that they don't get paid unless they've achieved the treatment goals laid out by the federal government of 90% control. And because that is the culture of this, many of these contractors have clauses that guarantee their work. And you should see a clause like that on a contract for invasive plant control. So I think we can move on from there. And Peter, I know that I don't have a lot of time, and so I don't know how deeply into this I want to delve. I was going to talk about the muddy waters, which are glyphosate, but we may have to sort of skip on to some of the closing remarks, and if people have questions, we can talk about them in the question and answer.
Okay, we've still got 7 minutes left. If you want to,
okay,
if you want to do an abbreviated bit on glyphosate,
yeah,
I think that's a popular topic.
Yeah, I will give it a run for its money. Okay, so Corey, if you click there, glyphosate, I did it. I said Voldemort. I have brought up the demon itself. So if you click to the next one, Corey, I want to talk about glyphosate, and I'm talking about this particularly because I can tell you from experience that glyphosate is the most commonly applied herbicide for invasive plant control. And it really brings to question, why is this chemical so ubiquitous? Why is everybody using glyphosate? And to get at the answer for that, I think we need to understand it a little bit. So it's a non-selective herbicide. That means that it treats almost all living plants because of the way that it works. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But if you're looking to control invasive plants, they often don't appear by themselves or alone. So I was on a property the other day that had glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, Japanese barberry, winged euonymus, right? It was bush honeysuckle. They were all there. Everybody had come out to play. And if you're a contractor, you're looking for a tool that's going to help you control all of those species at the same time. It was first registered in 1974. This chemical is not new to us. It's not something that's untested. We have a lot of data about glyphosate, and I'll talk about that more. The mode of action it uses, it is an herbicide. It attacks a chemical pathway that only exists in plants. And therefore, by its very nature, it is not toxic, not acutely toxic to non-plant organisms. We don't as people, we don't share that chemical pathway. Glyphosate can't kill us in the same way that it kills a plant. So that's an important aspect of this herbicide and actually many herbicides. Research has shown that it binds to soil very quickly, and it also degrades relatively quickly compared to other herbicides. So to give you some examples, I wasn't able to find some data for our forests, but in European forests, which are a very similar climate zone and ecosystem, there are no measurable traces of glyphosate in a forest after application in less than a year's time. I know that I've read studies that purport that there are high levels of glyphosate in places like waterways and surface waters and drinking waters. And all of those studies have focused very heavily on agricultural basins. And if you think of our Midwestern agricultural basins, you have often degraded soils. You don't have vegetation cover year round. There's a lot of runoff. And it's actually, the glyphosate is bound to the soils, but those soils are moving. And so the forestry situation is very different. And lastly, I want to talk about this fact that it has no residual soil activity. And this may seem like a no-brainer, but I can tell you that there are lots of herbicides out there that do have residual soil activity. And what that means that if you apply that herbicide and some of it is deposited onto the ground, a plant can absorb that herbicide from the soil and be killed. And so if you are looking to be selective about what plants you are killing with an herbicide, soil active herbicides are really dangerous. And they also, some of them are able to move, they're water soluble, and they're able to move through the soil layers, and they can show up places that you didn't apply them and still be active. So glyphosate, because of this suite of properties it has, is actually considered in the world of herbicides to be relatively environmentally benign. And it is the fact that it was benign that really made it the go-to chemical for our agricultural systems. And the rest of that story, I don't need to really tell anybody. Glyphosate is, in my opinion, overutilized in agricultural settings. It's led to the development of genetically modified organisms that are resistant to it, which I think myself and many other people are ethically opposed to. And it has brought a lot of scrutiny to the chemical because of concerns about prolonged exposure to workers and people who eat food crops, et cetera. So that scrutiny, if you click, Corey, I think I've got a picture of some, this is an example. I think this is soybeans, right? We have herbicide application has become a cornerstone of these systems. But if we go to the next slide, somebody just threw in something about the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And you couldn't talk about glyphosate without talking about the IARC. So the IARC is it's an international organization. It is well esteemed. I am not here to tear the IARC down tonight. I am going to talk about what the IARC findings mean, and I'm going to use their own words. So IARC found glyphosate, they categorized it as a 2A, probably carcinogenic. It's joined in that category by things like drinking piping hot beverages, night shift work, or red meat consumption. And what the IARC says is that this is a hazard rating, not a risk assessment. If we go to the next slide, Corey, I know that there's a lot of text here, but the IARC says that a hazard rating is the most important first step in risk assessment. So they have they've looked at the research, they have determined that glyphosate is probably is carcinogenic in humans. And so the next question then is, how do you then evaluate the scale of that risk? How do you do a risk assessment, which they do not do? And so a risk assessment is when you make decisions about setting the level of exposure that society is willing to accept. and this is quoted directly from them, talking about control measures in occupational settings, including things like personal protective equipment for applicators. What time of year can something be applied? How often and what settings can it be applied? And our EPA has already addressed so many of these risk assessment criteria for glyphosate. And Corey, if you go to the next slide, I want to compare how this product is used in an agriculture versus an invasive plant control setting. In agriculture, it's applied annually. It's applied at a landscape scale. It's applied in high volumes. It's applied to products we eat. In invasive plant control, we are applying it on a very small window of time with lasting effects. It's being applied not on a landscape scale, but to selected forest locations. It's being applied to stable soils. And most important for me, it's being applied with a different mindset. The invasive plant control mindset is not one of maximizing profit. It's not a mindset of getting the most out of a system. It's a mindset that says, I am concerned about this ecosystem and I want to do the greatest good I can with the least amount of harm. And if we go to the next slide, Corey, that's really where I want to kind of wrap this whole thing up. Are herbicides in general appropriate for invasive plant control? And first, I want to remind you that they shouldn't be used by themselves. They are part of a strategy. This should be part of, I want to go back to that toolbox, right? This needs to be paired with all of the tools for successful control. I also want to remind you that just because there's synthetic chemicals, sometimes there are better options than the natural ones available out there. And not all herbicides are created equal. You should be, understanding and learning about the herbicides that you're choosing to use. So if we go to the last slide here, Corey, I'm slightly over time, but so, are herbicides an appropriate tool for invasive plant control, and which is the greater risk? Is it a greater risk to using these synthetic chemicals in a forestry environment, or is it a greater risk if we use techniques that are not effective and not efficient in order to control invasive plants at our landscape? And for me personally, it's, click away, Corey, because it's an easy response for me. I think invasive plants are the greater risk. And as I mentioned before, this is not an evaluation that I'm the only one to have reached the conclusion on. I'm joined by a great number of conservation organizations that have also sort of made this call that our ecosystems are in danger because of invasive plants. We have a group of tools through integrated pest management that are available to us. And one of those tools is chemical herbicides. And they need to stay in that toolbox if we're going to have success in controlling these plants. So I think that's it for me. Thank you all very much. And I'll be back for questions, but Peter, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'll make this quick. We've got one more webinar in this series. Hard to believe there's only one more left. Jennifer Garrett, who is a regional stewardship manager and an excellent botanist, will be leading us through early detection species, and we'll be looking at early detection and rapid response from two different scales, both looking at new species that might be coming to Vermont and how to recognize those, and also thinking about how to look at your region or your area and notice and control those species that maybe are common other places but aren't where you are, and how to use those principles of early detection and rapid response to control them. And if you want to register, go to the Conservation District events website, and there's a registration link there. And then on the next slide, Corey's going to send around a survey. We've gotten some really great responses from people, really thoughtful, and it's so helpful. So if you could fill out that survey, we'll be sending it out after the, there's the, Corey just put a link in the chat. really any feedback you have to help us improve these presentations in the future and help us think about what other resources you'd like and what other topics maybe you'd like us to cover would be super helpful. And I think that's it. We're ready for questions. I just want to thank Andrew for an excellent presentation. Jack, you want to read off a few questions?
Sure, I think we had quite a lot of back and forth, and Chris Olson jumped in there too. And
thank you, Chris, for hopping in there. I think you did a good job of answering those, but I could add to some of them if people. Yeah, go ahead, Jack, if you want to field these in the order they make sense.
Sure. I mean, I think if there's ones in particular that you noticed that you want to add to, you should feel free to add to them.
So I'm just going to go glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in some Roundup products. And maybe I should actually address that first, but that is the most common chemical used for the cut stem treatment method. But I'm going to talk about the pesticide label one more time because there are other chemicals which are labeled for use with cut stem treatment method. And so what you're looking for is understanding that label. And the VT Invasives website or the extension service could actually assist you a lot with helping to make those decisions. Somebody else here mentions triclopyr for cut stem treatment method, and triclopyr is labeled that way, but they talked about mixing it with diesel fuel. And Chris, thank you, Chris, for responding that diesel fuel is, there are additives that you could use as a carrier for that triclopyr that are intended for that purpose. Diesel fuel is not intended for that purpose, and it doesn't have a very nice environmental profile. So I would avoid using diesel fuel, and the label is not going to include the fact that it can be mixed with diesel fuel, but it will have some specific purpose, specific chemicals that it can be mixed with as a carrier for that. A lot of people are using something like an oil-based cut stem treatment because you can use it later into the winter, a water-based chemical for cut stem treatments. You can't use it once you're at freezing conditions, which should make sense to everybody.
Hey, Andrew, there was a question early on. Nick wanted to know whether hydro spray or mist blower for a large-scale buckthorn. I guess it depends a little bit on what your definition of large scale is. Might need a little more information if Nick is still there.
Yeah, it would be helpful, Nick, if you send some additional information. It looks like he may have also sent me a direct message. The name of the funding source for there had that question, it is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And they have a program called the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. You know we're talking about the federal government because they've got lots of acronyms. But the EQIP program is helping provide some cost share for landowners specific to invasive plants.
Another one that came up was, do you worry about the use of herbicides on birds, good bugs, and good plants?
Yeah, good plants, I definitely worry about the use of herbicides. You want to, understand what application method you're using and what the potential is for the herbicide you're applying to end up on other plants, besides the ones you intended it for. And that can happen because of overspray, right? You spray a chemical, but some of the droplets drift onto a plant very close by. And depending on the method you use, overspray can be a larger issue. And so in small infestations and near a lot of native plants, you'll see people using protective cones that will keep overspray really limited. In places where all you have is invasive plants, and that is not an uncommon situation, especially for a species like Japanese knotweed or multiflora rose, then overspray becomes much less of an issue. You know, in terms of birds and bugs, the herbicides that have mentioned so far are not acutely toxic to any of those creatures. So, you know, they're not going to be poisoned by an herbicide. The mode of action that, you know, I shouldn't say an herbicide because it's not true maybe of all herbicides, but glyphosate and triclopyr I know I'm familiar with, and the mode of action they're using is specific to plants, and they shouldn't be a toxic to either of those organisms you mentioned there. So somebody in here mentions that glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, but in ready to use, if you walk into your hardware store, your local Agway or whatever, there are lots of ready to use products, RTU products, and the percentage of active ingredient and what active ingredients are in those varies really widely. And, you know, a lot of people use the phrase Roundup. I've heard that compared to using the phrase Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola is a brand name, but you could be getting Coke Zero or Diet Coke or Cherry Coke or Vanilla Coke, or I don't even know all the types of Coke that are out there, right? Roundup is very similar. There are actually 70 different products that have been released under the Roundup title, and they have different ingredients in them. They have different concentrations of those ingredients. And so that's really where that learning and using that pesticide label as your guide, that's really going to tell you whether or not the product that's on that shelf is appropriate for what you're doing. And don't get suckered by the notion that a higher percentage is a stronger product or it's going to do a better job. In fact, many times applying too much of an herbicide can cause damage not very dissimilar from vinegar. It can actually damage the leaves enough that the leaves die, and the herbicide never makes it down to the root system, and you don't get good control. So just because something has more active ingredient doesn't make it better. And there's also nasty tricks that these companies play where you'll see like Roundup Fast Act, you know, like a fast acting product that's going to get you control quicker. What they've done is they've taken a systemic herbicide that's going to kill the roots, and they've mixed it with an herbicide that kills just the leaves. And so if you've applied glyphosate to a plant as an herbicide, it can take 2 or 3 weeks before you start seeing that plant show signs of bad health. And so that is a long time for a lot of people who aren't familiar with herbicides. And so the company has added in other ingredients that make the plant look like it's dying quicker, right? And those are just marketing schemes. And a lot of them can be dispelled with doing your homework and understanding what's going on. So yeah, so thank you. I think Chris mentioned in there about RTU products and labeling. Anybody else see some other questions that as I'm scrolling?
Yeah, I see a question from Melissa. This is a little bit earlier on, but she asked about using herbicide near or in water. And Robert responded, mentioning how it's often difficult for the general public to gain access to that kind of herbicides. But if you could speak to using herbicides in riparian areas and maybe how to go about, if you're a landowner with invasive plants in or near water, how to approach that control situation.
Yeah. Aquatic environments are sensitive habitats, and I don't know what's available to the consumer market. I do know that the professional market has access to herbicides that are safe to use in aquatic environments. And, you know, one of the reasons for this is that a lot of the herbicides that are available on the shelves of a hardware store are, as Chris mentioned, ready to use products. That means that it has an active herbicide ingredient, but it's also been mixed with and concocted with what are technically called adjuvants. And these other chemicals assist the herbicide in being effective. Maybe they're helping to disperse surface tension so that the herbicide gets on more of the leaf area, or maybe they're helping to etch the waxy layer of the leaf so the herbicide can get absorbed by the plant. In many cases, it's actually those adjuvants, those additives along with the herbicide that are really toxic to aquatic environments or to other living things. And a number of the issues that have been brought up with Roundup over the years actually ended up being about the additives rather than about glyphosate. That's very true about some of the early concerns about the impact of Roundup on amphibians. So if you are concerned about additives, then you really need to get to the next level of knowledge in which you're mixing your own solutions, which is what all of the commercial contractors are doing, because then they can control every aspect of the solution and they know the properties of that solution and where it's appropriate to apply it. So it can be difficult as an individual landowner. I can say that if you read the label on something like Roundup Custom, which is a Roundup concentrate of glyphosate and has no additives to it, I think that label does indicate that it could be used in aquatic environments. So, and it's also a label that allows for cut stem treatments. So if you can identify that product and make sure you're looking at that label, but that's a product that could be used in that particular manner in that particular environment. So that's really, the label is going to tell you the most information about that. But rather than reading hundreds of labels, your extension agency might also be able to give you some of those details. There's a limit to how much I'm sort of legally allowed to say given the type of license I have. So other questions out there?
There were a couple of folks who wanted to know about cut stem application of herbicides. What's the best time and the best concentration to use?
Yeah, so the label is going to have information about concentration. I think there's I think down to about 18 or 20% active ingredient is sort of the recommended threshold, but oftentimes it's used in a 50% solution with water. And in terms of what time of year you can do it, this part is really important, but I also find it to be a little bit ecologically intuitive. So you can use that herbicide any time of year when there's sort of net transport of material from the leaves of a plant down into the root system. And so during the growing season, like the summer, you can use a cut stem treatment method. In the fall, it's a very effective method because the plant is transporting lots of materials down to the root system. And you can use it into the winter until freezing conditions if you're using a water-based solution, because once things are solidly frozen, the water won't move any longer, right? And then the time of year to really avoid is the springtime. The springtime plants are taking resources from the root system back up to grow their leaves and their buds. And so applying herbicide at that time of year to the cut stem, it'll just get flushed out by the resources coming up from the root system. So avoid the springtime. aim for the summer or fall and into early winter. Sam says he's mailing us all cookies. He's our county forester, and he's a great resource. You know, if you have further questions like, how do I find out about contractors, or who is the NRCS? Sam Schnesky is our Windham County forester if you live in Windham County like I do, and he's a fantastic resource and a really easy guy to talk to. So please hit him up for the questions you might have.
Can I put something in here real quick? There's been a lot of talk about the core manual and certification and stuff. Everybody, this is what the core manual looks like.
Thanks, Chris.
Pretty beefy. And then this is the category for forestry as well. So that's what we've been referring to.
I don't see any other questions. Do you, Jack or Corey?
No, I think we got them all.
Yeah, I see a quick question here about, do you think it's worth the time and money as a landowner to get certified as an applicator? And I would say you don't necessarily need to get certified, but having those resources that Chris just showed and perusing through them is worth your time and money. I think that will pay back dividends in terms of being informed. And I didn't touch on tons of topics that are in there that are really important to herbicide usage. So, you know, spend the time to flip through those resources and get yourself familiar with them. I really wish they were just free, but I guess somebody put time into them and they deserve to get paid for that. So.
Is Sam Schnesky still here? Sam may have left.
No, he's there.
Is he, Sam, can you put your email address in the chat box, if you don't mind? Some folks have asked for that. I also just shared the link to the survey again. If you get a free moment and can take that, that would be great. And I also shared a link to our webpage where a lot of the resources that had been discussed are shared. Thanks, Sam. Well, thank you so much for joining this evening. Thank you, Andrew, for the fantastic presentation.
Yeah, no problem.
We will send out a follow-up email with the link to the recording of tonight and also the link to the survey again in case you need it. So always feel free to reach out with questions.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining me.